How do social media capture action and retain attention? The problem for social media companies has always been how to capture and keep audiences' attention while also getting them to engage and thus produce data. To help them do this, they often draw on a history of behavioral design. More specifically, they draw on the theories of B.F. Skinner, who was an American psychologist, behaviorist, as well as inventor, author, and social philosopher, and a professor of psychology at Harvard University. B.F. Skinner belonged to the psychological paradigm called behaviorism, which emerged and became popular and very often understood itself as opposed to psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis that had been popularized by Freud decades before were interested in the unconscious as a determining factor, in observable behavior as a symptom but not the cause of an underlying problem, and early childhood as the critical stage. Behaviorists were rather interested not so much in unconsciousness, but rather at observable behavior, that is, what a person does rather than feels, thinks, or remembers. Behaviorists were also interested in current conditioning, and they argued that early habits can be unlearned. B.F. Skinner's early work was with animals. As a graduate student at Harvard, he devised the operant conditioning chamber, better known as the Skinner box, which was used to study animal behavior. The chamber contained a response mechanism that the animal would be trained to use, typically by rewarding the animal with food. What was the operant conditioning hypothesis? Well, that was that actions that are followed by reinforcement will be strengthened and more likely to be repeated in the future. B.F. Skinner thus saw it as a method of learning that occurs through rewards and punishments for behavior. He put his thesis to use during the war, where he worked on a program called Project Pigeon, also known as Project ORCON, short for Organic Control. ORCON was an experimental project to create pigeon-guided missiles. The pigeons were trained by Skinner to peck at a target and were rewarded with food when they completed the task correctly. Skinner designed a missile that carried pigeons which could see the target through the windows. The pigeons would peck at the target. The pecking in turn would control the missile's tail fins, keeping it on course by a metal conductor connected to the bird's beak, transmitting the force of the pecking to the missile's guidance system. The pigeons' accuracy, according to Skinner's preliminary tests, were nearly perfect. As part of the training, Skinner also tested the tenacity of the pigeons. He fired a pistol next to their heads to see if loud noise would disrupt their pecking. He put the pigeons in a pressure chamber, setting the altitude at 10,000 feet. The pigeons were whirled around in a centrifuge meant to simulate massive G-forces. He exposed them to bright flashes meant to simulate shell bursts. But the pigeons kept pecking because they'd been trained to do so. When the war ended, ORCON was classified. It had never been operationalized in combat, and later the public was presented with Skinner's idea still through animals, but rather, for instance, pigeons trained in ping pong. Skinner's theoretical implications was in particular felt in the field of educational psychology. Skinner argued that the behavioral reinforcement students received at the time was primarily aversion in the form of punishment. But learning to Skinner was a behavior, and a behavior that needed positive contingencies of reinforcement. These positive reinforcements should minimize the chances of doing something wrong, that is, getting the wrong answer, for example. And that also made him dislike multiple choice tests, which would maximize the chances of getting something wrong. And importantly, Skinner also held that reinforcements, that is, the positive reinforcements, should be immediate. For that purpose, he invented the teaching machine. This machine would allow the student to move at their own pace through the material. The immediate response was a reward. That is, the reward was getting to move on to the next exciting question or concept. Today, these features reappear as personalized learning, and we know them, for instance, through Kahoots. Later, Skinner became subject to intense criticism. He held that the goal of behavioral technology should be to design a world in which behavior likely to be punished seldom or never occurs. That is, he wanted to not only predict bad behavior, but preempt it to ensure that it would never happen in the first place. He called this a world of automatic goodness. And he held that this would make the world safer. But not everyone was enamored with B.F. Skinner's ideas of behavioral technologies. In particular, Skinner's theories on freedom, which he rejected, caused criticism. Noam Chomsky provided the most critical review, a frontal assault on Skinner's scientific claims and results, which provided a damning critique of behaviorism. Later, the field of psychology and the paradigm that Skinner belonged to was also supplanted by other fields and paradigms such as cognitive science. But that's another story. What we're interested here is Skinner's legacies in today's datafied environments. Today, behaviorism might be outdated as a psychological paradigm, but strands of the theories and ideas have sprung up again in software environments. Most notably, they've influenced B.J. Fogg and his persuasive technology lab at Stanford. Fogg founded the lab in 1998 to develop the field he called captology, a name derived from the acronym for Computers as Persuasive Technologies. The lab's mission, according to its website, is to create insights into how computing products, from websites to mobile phones, software, can be designed to change people's beliefs and behaviors. Among the lab's alumni are a co-founder of the photo sharing service Instagram and Nir Eyal. Fogg defines persuasion as a non-coercive attempt to change attitudes or behaviors. Thus, his vision of captology focuses on voluntary change, definitionally excluding force or trickery, and ultimately depending on the agency of the persuaded. Fogg vowed to use his knowledge of captology for good, not least in the field of education, which he shared with Skinner. But Fogg was not the only one interested and inspired by behaviorism. The behavioral economist Dan Ariely and his book Predictably Irrational was also really popular and helped make behaviorism an important paradigm in Silicon Valley. He describes how the apparent irrationality of human behavior, which threatens the rational actor model that has historically characterized both economics and engineering, can be viewed from another lens through behavior theories, which recover prediction from irrationality's clutches. making human action once again amenable to such modeling. As he emphasizes, people may be irrational, but they're still predictable, and where there is prediction, there is also the potential for profit. Another important figure in the field of behavioral technologies was Nir Eyal, a Silicon Valley blogger and entrepreneur who wrote the book Hooked in 2014. The book is subtitled How to Build Habit-Forming Products, and it outlines a behaviorist paradigm for software design. Companies that want to acquire users need to inculcate habits in them. And successful companies like Facebook have become successful, Eyal writes, by becoming first to mind. Their users feel a pang of loneliness, as he notes, and before rational thought occurs, they're scrolling through their Facebook feeds. Achieving this goal requires thinking of users not as customers choosing among various commodities, but as instinctual minds susceptible to subtle outside influences. Eyal writes, companies must learn not only what compels users to click, but what makes them tick. Eyal also offers an ethical model for how to build ethical products with hooks. And he offers examples of how these hooks work in different social media. This is the example of Fortnite. Another important figure and invention was Loren Brichter, who developed the code for the now ubiquitous gesture known as pull to refresh in Twitter. In an interview, Loren Brichter explains that it was literally 5 lines of code that he put in and thought nothing more of it. But then, as he noticed, people started putting it in everything. Some people started likening it to a slot machine. And indeed, Twitter really has that feel that one never knows when a pellet is going to come down the chute. And the same with Facebook. One logs on and keeps scrolling to see when am I going to get the next little hit. And for those reasons, many people argue that it can make sense to think about them as a digitally enhanced Skinner box. BJ Fogg's slideshow from 2007 shows how difficult it is for behaviorist technologies who wish to do good. This is a slide where Fogg claims a stake in developing what he calls a peace technology. What he talks about is Facebook. In this slide, he outlines the Facebook course taught us ways to persuade people on a mass scale. He also notes that his lab will use the power of persuasion on a mass scale to resolve big problems. And he sets himself a huge goal, which is to use persuasive technology to achieve world peace by 2037. That would be over a 30-year intervention. Looking at his huge goal today in 2020, almost midway, it is almost impossible to believe that Facebook will become the peace technology of 2037. And it shows how difficult it is to do good with technology, especially in the field of behavioral science. With more and more critical individuals voicing concerns over the mechanisms of social media, industry stakeholders and scholars have now begun to reassess their role in creating addictive technologies. One example includes Nir Eyal himself, who wrote the follow-up book Hooked, called Indistractable. In this book, Ayal offers the reader the chance to learn how to master the technologies he himself has helped develop. This has become a pattern. Those who've developed the addictive environments and technologies have now also become key in offering lifestyle advice and technologies that can help us master them. And this leaves the question behind, the question about agency. To what extent should behavioral technologies be allowed? Who should program them? Who should set the targets for when they're doing good? And how should they be governed? Moreover, it also asks a more fundamental scientific question. Namely, do we even believe that technologies can be addictive? That's a discussion for another time.